Hi, I'm Miss Punjaba.
Hi, I'm Miss Hilgarod and I'm one of the English teachers at Ricards Lodge.
Hi, I'm Miss Madison.
Hi there, I'm Miss Marshall.
I'm Miss Hager.
I am currently head of Key Stage 3 for English, and from September I'm going to be head of Key Stage 4, so managing the girls going from all the way through their GCSE. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for watching these videos and for really engaging with the process of your daughter's or the child that you care for's GCSE journey. So the reason that we wanted to provide this information to parents in advance of Year 10 was because we want to really help your daughter or the child that you care about achieve their full potential in GCSE. And one of the most influential factors in a student's progress is to have the support and understanding from all areas of their lives. So we've got a kind of 360 approach to the support available to them. But it can be tough to help the girls with, say, a 19th century novel that you may not have read, or to support with Shakespeare when your only kind of memory of Shakespeare is being terribly bored of it in school, or alternatively you're somebody who loves literature and has a real passion for it and would like to know the best way that you can use that knowledge and passion that you have for literature to really effectively support your daughter throughout their GCSE journey. The way that we've kind of structured this video is that I'm going to give you an overview of the whole GCSE programme, and then you'll see various different members of my team giving you a more in-depth look at the literature text and the language exam. For GCSE English, there are two qualifications that the girls get. There's GCSE English Language, which is the one you have to retake if it's not passed in Year 11. So all sixth form colleges and school sixth forms run a retake programme. So if for some reason something goes awry and one of the girls doesn't pass the GCSE, there are programmes in place wherever they end up for Year 12 to support them to retake it. And most people usually retake in November and will have passed by that point. And then the other is obviously English Literature. So you get a qualification for each, and both of those qualifications are assessed entirely by exam at the end of Year 11. And both papers have two exams, two kind of sections to them. So that works out then that at the end of Year 11, the girls take 4 English exams, 2 language and 2 literature. There's no coursework anymore. That was gotten rid of a couple of years ago. So as I said, it's so crucial and so important that revision is something that is a consistent and constant factor in the girls' lives from the beginning of Year 10 or even the end of Year 9 right through until they take those final exams in Year 11. So an exam breakdown then, with the language qualification, as I said, there are 2 exams. There's language paper 1, which is worth 50%, and that is about creative reading and writing. So the girls are asked to comment and analyse on fiction, and they are asked to write their own piece of creative writing. And then language paper 2 is worth 50% as well, obviously, and this is the non-fiction paper. So again, they look at some examples of non-fiction and are asked to comment on it and to analyse how the writers have used language in those papers, and then they are asked to write their own piece of non-fiction. Then we have literature paper 1, which is worth 40% of the entire mark, and that is Shakespeare. So we look at Macbeth and the 19th century novel, and that's where we look at Jekyll and Hyde. And then you have literature paper 2, which is worth 60%, and that is where we look at modern texts and we look at an Inspector Calls. Poetry, they have an anthology of 15 poems that they study, and then there's an unseen poetry element to that exam as well. So on to what I really want to kind of focus on, and that is what's the big idea of the literature text that we study. So our intention as English teachers is to make literature relevant and for the girls to connect on a real personal level with the characters, themes and ideas in each text. We therefore created a big idea which works for each text, including the poetry. So this works as an anchor or a foundation for the girls to hold on to, and also when used in an exam demonstrate the kind of high-level ability to engage with the writer's intentions and ideas. In terms of the text that we study, the big idea that we've come across and decided upon is the concept of the individual desire versus social expectation. We consider the constant conflict between these two things and the need to balance these two things as human beings. So how much of our individual needs, wants and desires can be explored in a way that maintains social expectation and morality? So all the writers in each of the texts that we study have explored this question in a number of different ways with varying degrees of conclusion, some of who don't come to a conclusion and just pose that question throughout their text. So we look at this conflict across the centuries, bearing in mind the changing social expectations as we move through history, and we see this conflict between the individual and society constantly evolve and change. So starting off, we're in the 16th century with Shakespeare. It's a patriarchal society, which means men are dominant over women. So the woman's voice is not heard as much and men have ultimate power and control. So then we look in our text at how do the female characters respond to this? And just as equally as importantly, how does this impact the way that male characters behave? Are their characters pushing the boundaries of what is socially acceptable? And what impact is this having on them and those around them? Then we jump ahead a couple of hundred years to the 19th century, where we are looking at the Jekyll and Hyde. And some of the poetry fits into this as well. So as we see technology and science advance and the religious traditions start to lose ultimate control, what does this mean for the individual within society? And how does this individual desire for progression impact on wider society? Then we move into the 20th century as we look at an spectacles and again some of the poetry. So in the wake of 2 world wars, unemployment crises, economic hardship, how has society responded to that? So we've got the development of the welfare state and society moving generally towards a more socially conscious way of behaving, where we think about the impact that our individual behaviour has on everybody. So can an individualistic approach really work anymore within those new parameters? And then finally we're at the 21st century, where we look at the rest of our poetry and some of the language extracts from the language papers. And then we're thinking, so how do we balance this conflict in the modern world? And how do the girls themselves see themselves as part of the wider society and how their individual choices and behaviours impact on those around them? So this is the big idea of our text, and hopefully has given you a good foundation of knowledge about what we are getting the girls to consider at GCSE English. Thanks very much.
I'm going to talk about Macbeth, which is the Shakespeare component of the English Literature Paper 1. So there you will get an extract, just a little detail about the exam itself. You have to analyse language and analyse structure from this extract from the play, and then you have to link it to the big ideas in Macbeth, which we'll go into in a second. And then you have to refer out to the whole play. So a lot of people were worried, got to learn 465,000 quotes off by heart. No, you don't. All you have to do is make sure that you analyse the language and structure in the extract, and then you can refer to other aspects of the play where the same things come up. So if it was, how does Shakespeare present power in Macbeth, and the extract was about Macbeth, then you might refer out to the whole play and see how Shakespeare similarly presented power through Lady Macbeth, etc. So the benefit of doing Macbeth over Romeo and Juliet is, one of the things is that in year 8, the girls, you study Macbeth at a kind of preparatory level. You still do the same things, we still teach you in the same way that you'll be taught at GCSE. So a lot of you know Macbeth already, you know the plot and you know lots of things about the ideas behind it as well. So this is hugely advantageous if you're going to study at GCSE, as you have got such a lot to study. So that's really cool. In terms of the big idea, we are linking, as you know, across the literature text, individual desire versus society's expectations. And in preparation for this, you really need to watch some Jeremy Kyle, you need to watch some EastEnders, and a little bit of Judge Rinder, and anything involving crime, basically, and jealousy, betrayal, and carnage. Because it gets pretty bloody. But the way that Shakespeare presents Macbeth as having this moment, has this sort of thought that comes into his mind, hang on, I could do it, right? And how that develops. Does he pull back at any time? No, he doesn't. This is what he wants. And similarly with Lady Macbeth, and it's interesting to see how Shakespeare plays with stereotypical perceptions and beliefs about the role of women and how they are and how they should be. Compared with Lady Macbeth. So over the summer, please, please, please be the spoddy one in the class who's read it. You could all be the spoddy ones in the class because you've all read it. So you cannot be too prepared, all right? Think about these things, read it, read studies on Macbeth, watch films about Macbeth, whether it's like realistic Macbeth or a Shakespeare retold, where you get a kind of modern adaptation of the story, and really prepare yourself for September, because it'll be so much easier if you're coming to class with thoughts, ideas, questions, challenges, all the rest of it, and you'll really enjoy it.
I'm going to be talking about the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde unit of the GCSE curriculum. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a 19th century text written by Robert Louis Stevenson and can be found on Literature Paper 1. It's set in Victorian London and tells the story of a respectable Dr. Jekyll and his relationship with the violent and detestable Mr. Hyde. So to give a quick summary, Dr. Jekyll is a scientist, very popular, very well respected, and he becomes increasingly private with his new friend Mr. Hyde as we learn from his friend's perspective, Utterson. Mr. Hyde is hated by Victorian society and commits several acts of violence, including murder. However, for some reason, unbeknownst to Utterson, Jekyll keeps him in his will, promising all his money and all his property can go to Hyde if he passes, and keeps him as a close friend, allowing him around his house. It isn't until the final chapter of the novel, chapter 10, which is from Jekyll's perspective, that we find out that actually Jekyll and Hyde are the same person. Dr. Jekyll had created a drug that was intended to separate his goodness from evil. He's a person that actually was very two-faced in his day-to-day life and really liked committing acts of sin and wanted to see if he could separate that part of himself. And he inadvertently creates a being of true evil and primitive instinct. Initially, he's choosing to transform into Mr. Hyde, but over time, Hyde becomes more powerful than he is, and even when he decides he doesn't want to change into him anymore, Hyde is too strong, and not being able to cure or control it anymore, he commits suicide. So we found that the students really enjoyed this text, as it has lots of interesting discussions around it about the power of good versus the power of evil, about whether we're all born evil, whether we all actually want to commit acts of sin if the rules of society were taken away from us. And Stevenson's main concept is that of duality, that people are a mixture of good and evil, a mixture of character. And we found that the ability to understand this concept from a personal perspective really encourages the students to analyse the big ideas of the book, to analyse the duality of the characters within it, which is a very high level skill. Another pivotal theme in the book is that of reputation. The characters are often seemingly good based on maintaining a reputation within society, and also they maintain Jekyll's secret for a very long time, even when they have their own suspicions, and that was to maintain the reputation of their friend. So being bound by the desire to maintain a reputation is something that the students are, again, really easy to understand. They understand the desire to maintain a friend's privacy and reputation. So this text is in section B of Literature Paper 1, a paper that is 40% of the overall English literature grade. Section B is 30 marks, because it doesn't have the 4 spag marks that Shakespeare has. Students have 1 hour, 45 minutes for the whole of literature paper 1. And while the assessment is closed book, which means you have to memorise quotes and the plot, the text would have been studied and analysed in detail in class. In the assessment, the students will be given a question and a short extract from the text, and they will have to answer the question using both the specific extract they are given and their knowledge of the text as a whole. They'll be analysed on their assessment of themes, of characters, and the way in which Stevenson was influenced and presents them. So this will include a range of relevant quotations, not only the ones that are in the extract provided, and comments on the choice of language and structural features. Students will have to make sure that they include comments on the contextual influences on the novel. So, what can you do while you're in Year 9? So before meeting this text, students could read other 19th century novels, such as Sherlock Holmes, Frankenstein, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and these are all on the accelerated reader system as well, so they can be reading them as their accelerated reader book. Students may be interested in researching Freud's theory of the id, ego and superego, and Carl Jung's theory of self. 2 theories that can give students a very high level and sophisticated angle on the novel. Students could also do research on Victorian society, social traditions, the rising age of science, and the influence of religion. In addition to this, there are several revision textbooks that we would recommend here, such as CGP and York Notes.
I'll be talking to you about an Inspector Calls, which is part of the literature course that pupils have to complete for a GCSE. I would actually like to start, before getting into what an Inspector Calls is about, I would like to start with the big ideas, the big themes, the message that J.B. Priestley is exploring in the text. We actually start with encouraging the girls to think about some big philosophical ideas and ask them questions like, what is your role in society? Can you look after yourself and your family whilst also looking after others in society? Do people who are not on benefits benefit from the welfare and the benefit system as well? So they're pretty heavy questions, as you can see, and there are big themes that are connected to these questions, like, for example, that no man is an island or woman. What is our social responsibility? What is the class struggle or a class struggle? And what is privilege and what is disadvantage? And how do you behave when you are privileged? And how do you behave when you are disadvantaged? And also big themes like generational conflict. And the reason I started with themes is because it is what makes the text that we are studying interesting. And it is what gives you purpose and gives you the reason for studying this text. An Inspector Calls is a play, and it is set in 1912, which is before the First World War. It is actually set before the Titanic sinks, and that's important because it is mentioned in the play. Set at a time when Britain's middle classes were growing, and the privilege and the advantage that comes with that growing class is expanding as well. And so the story is that a mysterious police inspector visits the Burling family, which is an affluent family celebrating their daughter's engagement, and it's a family dinner. They are told that a girl called Eva Smith has just ended her life, and an investigation follows. The girls will be studying the different characters in the play and how these characters are involved with the central event, I suppose, which is Eva Smith's suicide. We are led through this play and encouraged to consider the responsibility each person has in what happened to the girl, to Eva Smith. There are strange sections in there. It ends in a very surreal way, and that is interesting because it throws up a lot of questions, and it makes us all who watch the play or who read the play think for a longer time about the play and what the message is in the play. The text itself, in terms of what the exam is, it's actually one section of the second exam paper in the literature course, and this paper 2 in the literature course is worth 60%, and An Inspector Calls is worth about 33% of that second paper. So it is actually worth more than the other 2 sections in that exam, so it is an important text to kind of understand, get your head around, and it's an important text to be able to write about well. So in the exam, they get to choose between two questions, a question usually on character and a question on a theme or one of the themes in the play. And they just have to write an essay answering this question. We recommend that the girls not only buy their own text, and so that they can actually make notes in the margins of the text when we are reading it together, or when they are reading it alone as well, but also that they might want to buy some revision guides. York Notes has a very good guide on unexpected calls, as does CGP revision guides. So yeah, I hope the girls will find this text as interesting and as thought-provoking as we in the English department do.
Hi, it's Marshall again. I'm going to be talking to you about the poetry. In our poetry anthology that the girls are given from the exam board, there are two what we call clusters of poetry, and in each cluster there are 15 poems. So one cluster is called Love and Relationships, and the other one is called Power and Conflict. So we study the Love and Relationships cluster, and the Power and Conflict cluster can be used as unseen poetry revision, which I'll get to in a bit. So within those 15 poems, in terms of practical skills, what the girls are being asked to do is use their knowledge of poetic terminology. So that's something that needs to be continuously revised and gone over and over again throughout the 2 years. And also predominantly looking at their comparative skills. So currently in Year 9, in this summer term, they are working on those comparative skills as we speak. By the time they get to this part of the GCSE in Year 10 and 11, they have got a really good foundation of knowledge about how to build an essay, and actually can really just focus on getting to grips with each of the poems rather than also learning from scratch how to write a comparative essay. We look at our 15 love and relationships poems, and we can break them down into two sections. One, the familial love poetry. Two, the romantic love poetry. So starting with familial love, what we have here is each of these poems are centred on a parent-child relationship, or at the very least a parental figure and child relationship. And what these poems take us through is the different stages of these relationships. So we've got growing up, moving out, reflecting on the death of a parent or a grandparent and reflecting on their own mortality, reflecting back on a parental figure from before the child was born, or as they've known them and their ideas about them has changed as they've grown up. And what these poems do, they really engage with the fluidity of these kind of relationships, the fact that they're in a constant state of flux as you move through various kind of stages of your life, and that they can change and grow and evolve. And what they really focus on is the fact that the child in each of these poems, whether that child be the speaker of the poem or the subject of the poem, is establishing their identity within the relationship and without the relationship. So then we look at romantic love. So the romantic love poems really give us a sense of focusing on the power of love and the equally negative and positive power of love. So how love can be damaging and heartbreaking, but also reinforcing and exciting and supportive. So we have poems that focus on the beginnings of relationships, how exciting and enticing that moment is. We also have poems that look at the endings of relationships. So sometimes the animosity of the end of the relationship, or sometimes the fact that sometimes relationships just fizzle out and just die, and that's part of life. And then thinking about the kind of ongoing impact that past relationships can have on us and have on us in terms of shaping who we become. And then we also have a couple of poems about forbidden love, and about how that manifests itself. And then also Love's Philosophy, which focuses on the lack of love and lamenting the fact that the speaker doesn't have love, even though everyone around him in nature and in the world does. So what can we do to prepare? What can the girls be doing to prepare for studying poetry? So each student has their own anthology already. So all of Year 9 have been given their anthology. And one of the best pieces of advice that I can give is just to read and read and reread and reread the poems. Get to know them really well, almost to the point of boredom, but just get to know those poems really well. Alongside that, use the various revision guides. So the ones that we recommend are obviously the CGP guides, the York Notes guides, English Bus and Mr. Bruff, and the various other online guides that are available out there to get to grips with what the poems are about, what they really mean, what the story of them is, and how the poets specifically have used poetic language and language devices and structural devices like rhythm and rhyme to add depth and strength to the messages that they're trying to communicate. But really, what it all comes down to with poetry is it's all about the tone. So you want to ask yourself the question, is this a positive or a negative poem? Is this poem that's about a parent and child good or bad? And if it's positive, what kind of positive is it? And if it's negative, what kind of negative is it? And then that's your answer, okay? There's your answer there in one sentence. And all you've got to do, just like in maths, is show you're working out. How did you know that that was a positive poem or a negative poem? What words are on the page that lead you to that conclusion? Okay, so on that subject about how we identify tone and how we really get to grips with the central ideas of a poem, leads me on just to quickly talk to you about the unseen poem element of Literature Paper 2. So alongside the anthology poems that they have to write about in the paper, the final part of the Literature Paper 2 exam gives them a brand new poem, which they have to apply their skills of poetry analysis and their knowledge of how to analyse poetry to a brand new poem that they've never seen before. They then get a second unseen poem, and for a measly yet important 8 marks, they then have to compare those two unseen poems, and they just do like one paragraph of comparison where they pick a language feature or a structure feature and just go nuts on that for 10 minutes and then they're done. So it's about being able to transfer those skills of poetry analysis across to a whole new poem, just to see how well they've been able to cement those skills. So hopefully that's given you some really good information and knowledge about the poetry section of the English GCSE.
I'm going to be talking you through all the GCSE language exams, so that is language paper 1 and 2. Each paper is worth 80 marks and they are both made up of a reading and a writing section. Language paper 1 is, in my opinion, the easier of the two, and it's all about fiction. The reading section is made up of 4 questions and they're nice and straightforward, and they use a lot of the skills that your daughter would have been practicing ever since year 7. Question 1 is all about retrieval of information. Question 2 is language analysis. Question 3, your daughter will have to analyse structure, and question 4 is evaluation. So they'll be given a statement where they have to search the text to find evidence of why that statement is true. A lot of these questions, particularly question 2 and 4, will follow the PES format that your daughter will be used to. Question 2 and 4 are all about reading back through the text and picking out language and analysing it. So it's a lot of putting in your quote and then saying things like this shows or this suggests. The writing section of this paper is my favourite part of the whole GCSE, and it is the descriptive and narrative task. This again is worth 40 marks. 24 marks of this are for creativity and 16 marks are for spelling and grammar. So it's really important that you get used to accurate grammar, punctuating correctly, using the correct apostrophe, the right type of there and where. They're really simple things that you need to master. In this question, you'll be given 2 options. One will be a picture stimulus and the other will be an idea for a story. Now, you don't have to just actually do one or the other, you can combine the 2, and this is where we find most of our girls end up getting the highest marks. Language paper 2 is slightly more difficult because it's all about non-fiction and it's types of text that the girls are less used to reading. Some as well might be from the 18th and 19th century, so the language is a bit more difficult to comprehend. This again has a reading and a writing section, with the reading section worth 40 marks and the writing section worth 40 marks. Another difference is, unlike paper 1 where you get given 1 extract, In paper 2, you get given 2, and it's all about comparison. One of the most difficult questions people find is question 4, where you have to compare the attitudes and viewpoints of the writers. But it's important to remember that this is very similar to a poetry comparison essay, which you'll all be used to doing. The writing section, again, has 24 marks for creativity and 16 for spelling and grammar. They give you a statement about a topic that you have to have an opinion on. So it might be homelessness, the NHS, or this year actually it was to do with sport. You then are given a text type and an audience that you have to write for. So it might be a newspaper article, a letter, a leaflet, a speech, and you'll be told whether you're writing to a governor, a head teacher, a friend, and you use that to help craft your answer. Each paper also takes 1 hour and 45 minutes, and you're advised to spend 10 minutes at the beginning of each paper sort of reading through the extracts, and then up to an hour on the reading section, and you want to leave your last 45 minutes on the writing section. My main piece of advice really is to get reading. The main difficulty with the language papers is you're answering questions on text that you've never seen before. So you can't memorise Macbeth quotes, you can't memorise an Inspector Calls quotes. The more you read, the easier you will find it. You also want to get your reading age as high as possible, because then you'll understand all the words on the paper. You don't want to get to some words and sort of stumble over their meanings. Because the questions always follow the same format as well, it's really easy, especially with language paper 1, to take a page from any book and just make up the questions for them. So it's easy to practice at home with whatever book, whatever newspaper you might be reading.